Good evening. I call to order the study session of the Lakewood City Council, Lakewood, Colorado, May 16th, 2016 at 7 p.m. The clerk, please call the roll.
Paul.
Here.
Wickman. Here. Vincent. Here. Roybal.
Here.
Harrison.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Shakti.
Here.
Abel. Here. Coop.
Here.
Franks.
Here.
Gutwein. You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. I want to thank those folks who are in the audience tonight. And if you might be tuning in at home, we actually have some students from Mullen who came out to join us and witness government in action. So I hope you really enjoy it. Should be a good presentation. So with that, we'll go right into item number 3, which is a presentation on comprehensive plan updates. Mr. Parker, good evening. Come on down.
Good evening, Mayor, City Council. My name is Travis Parker. I'm the Planning Director. I'm actually just coming up to introduce the topic. When we passed the comprehensive plan last year, we promised that we'd come back on an annual basis to update you on our progress. If you'll recall, there are a whole bunch of action items in that plan. And so tonight, Holly Boehm is here to present our annual status report of the comprehensive plan.
Thank you. Holly, good evening. It's a lot of fanfare. Welcome.
Well, good evening, and thank you. Holly Boehm with Comprehensive Planning and Research. And before I begin tonight, I'd also like to acknowledge Christy Horber, also with Comprehensive Planning and Research, and other staff that have helped with the development of this report for you tonight. Tonight, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the comprehensive plan, provide a brief background, update you on the implementation of the action steps, provide an example of some projects that we have accomplished this past year, and then talk a little bit about some projects on the horizon for this coming year. So a comprehensive plan is the city's long-range vision for the future. It's a policy document that's adopted by Planning Commission, and it provides guidance and decision-making to the City Council, Planning Commission, and city staff on decision-making. It is a document that helps us to plan for the future in a very thoughtful and cohesive and comprehensive manner. The city has had 4 comprehensive plans since it was incorporated in 1969. Obviously, the last one was adopted in 2015, April of last year. And comprehensive plans are really looked at every 10 to 15 years, so the city can continue to evaluate change over time and to address current and future needs of the community. The 2015 comprehensive plan, which we refer to as Lakewood 2025, was adopted after a 2-year public process. The comprehensive plan has 4 elements: the vision statement, which is a very broad aspirational statement that guides the city on where it should be in the future. Then it has guiding principles, which are very succinct, positive statements that help in the formation and foundation of the goals that are contained in the plan. The goals are very specific recommendations on how we should start to implement the guiding principle and the vision statement of the comprehensive plan. And then action steps are the true steps that the city should try to take to implement those goals. Our comprehensive plan contains 404 action steps. They are divided into 5 different categories: ongoing, annual, short-term, medium-term, and long-term. Ongoing action steps are those action steps that are done on a routine and continuous basis throughout the year without an end date. An example of an ongoing action step would be to maintain an ongoing system for surveying and documenting cultural resources within Lakewood. An annual action step is one that staff will do on an annual basis, and an example of an annual action step would be to review all of our other adopted plans, such as the Historic Preservation Plan, our Arts Master Plan, and our Community Resources Master Plan on an annual basis to make sure that we are actually implementing the action steps contained in those plans as well. Our short-term action steps are those that we have identified as action steps that should be accomplished within 3 years after adoption. Medium-term action steps are those that we have identified should be accomplished within 4 to 6 years after adoption of the plan. And then long-term are those that we should look at accomplishing by the end of the comprehensive plan or within 10 years. And today we are at year 1. So far, this past year, we have actually completed 3 short-term action steps. We have 31 that are underway. We have completed 1 medium-term action step and have 24 underway. And we actually have 1 long-term action step underway. The comprehensive plan is divided into 9 chapters. The 4 main chapters that contain the goals and action steps are Lakewood Lives, Lakewood Innovates, Lakewood Moves, and Lakewood Sustains. And I'm going to break these down. I'm going to provide an overview of some of the projects that we have achieved by chapter. Lakewood Lives is a chapter that really discusses the livability of Lakewood. It addresses sections and topics such as neighborhoods, housing, arts and culture, and parks, trails, and recreation. The guiding principle for Lakewood Lives, and this is the principle which set the foundation for the goals in the chapter, is Lakewood will be a safe, healthy, diverse, and vibrant community with strong and unique neighborhoods. In February of this year, the city partnered and participated in the Jefferson County Housing Exchange program, which was held by a number of people within the community to discuss the importance of creating a mix of housing options for all income levels within Jefferson County, and to discuss strategies and challenges for addressing these needs. The Heritage, Culture, and Arts Division has continued to implement its action steps. It appointed a public art committee, and the committee represents all wards within the city. And the committee has its first commission project, which is Dance of the Indian Paintbrush, right here on City Plaza. It has worked to expand new volunteer experiences, as well as to add and expand youth and heritage programs throughout the city. The Recreation Division continues its focus on engaging and expanding programs to engage the community and encourage participation in all their programs. They developed a fitness bingo challenge, which was a challenge that they tried to reach out to the community to promote a different type of fitness challenges for everybody, so they were kind of cross-training. They have partnered with Denver Metro Village Senior Community to develop on-site fitness classes there, and they also partnered with Dunston Middle School and developed a weight room orientation for the students at that school. We continue to be a certified Audubon our golf courses, both Homestead and Fox Hollow, continue to be certified Audubon Cooperative Sanctuary, which means that they meet certain standards of environmental consciousness management. We have also sent out a golf customer survey to get feedback from the community on how we can better manage and improve our golf courses. We have also updated the bike and recreation map, which highlights the trails and bike routes throughout the city and into our parks and open space. We have also focused heavily, I think, on our initiative for healthy neighborhoods. We have developed a local food resource website. We are in the process of conducting a Live Well food assessment, and we have actually partnered to work with the Jeffco Active Living Coalition and Food Policy Council. Our police department, as always, continues to promote and engage the community to build safe neighborhoods. This last year for National Night Out, they held 43 events. They have 134 properties that are enrolled in our crime-free housing program. And they actually have 384 active blocks that participate in our Neighborhood Watch program. Oops, sorry. We've also had a great opportunity to partner this year with the University of Colorado at Denver through the Hometown Colorado program. We were lucky to have 5 graduate classes come into the city and develop plans and work with the community on a variety of different topics, including developing a walkability study. They looked at and developed the Lasley Park Master Plan, which I'm sure you'll be hearing about in the future. And they also looked at developing a food access study. Lakewood Innovates chapter is our economic development chapter. It deals with strategies citywide as well as development strategies for our growth area and our community activity areas. The principle for this chapter is that Lakewood will invest in its future and proactively pursue a thriving and sustainable economy and make sure that we have a variety of employment, investment, and mixed-use opportunities throughout the city. The city has continued to focus on reinvestment and rejuvenating West Colfax Avenue. The West Colfax Vision 2040 Action Plan was adopted in August, I believe, of 2015. And the North Dry Gulch and Dry Gulch master plans are both underway to address the flooding issues in Colfax and adjacent to Colfax. We've also we have developed the Embrace the Facts marketing campaign to market West Colfax. We had a developers forum in May of 2015, and we've just launched a new website, Embrace the Facts, in April of 2016. We developed an excellent public-private partnership. The Reinvestment Authority partnered with Broad Street Realties to work on improvements at the Lamar Station Plaza, which is formerly JCRS, in case you don't know, at Colfax and Pierce. They worked to develop a wonderful landscape plan, public plaza in the parking lot there, as well as work to implement some of the 40 West placemaking elements. The city is currently conducting a 3-year-long retail study to assess Lakewood's unique retail challenges and to make sure that Lakewood can be strong in the future by attracting new and distinctive retail throughout. The city partnered with the Alameda Gateway Business Improvement District to develop the Alameda Avenue Streetscape Plan. This covers Alameda from Sheridan to Carr, with the focus on enhancing the gateway to Lakewood's downtown. And this plan can be helped to implement a lot of landscaping treatments, both with private and public partnerships and developments. The Rooney Valley Plan is currently underway, and as you guys know, you all just approved the new intergovernmental agreement with the town of Morrison. Lakewood Moves is a chapter that deals with Lakewood's transportation system and looks at it from a multimodal concept, including future transportation needs, complete streets, walkability. The guiding principle for this chapter that has guided the development of the goals and action steps is that Lakewood will support connectivity through a number of transportation options. Lakewood continues to be committed to improving its sidewalk connectivity. Currently, we've got Sheridan Boulevard from 6th to 10th in the design phase. A pedestrian connection between Pierce between Colfax and Rimcad is under construction, and the Oak Street sidewalk was recently completed in April, and that connects the Oak Street station with West Colfax. We are currently underway looking at updating our bicycle master plan called Planning for Pedaling. Concurrently with that, Lakewood is partnering to develop a Jeffco wayfinding system plan, which will develop a comprehensive and cohesive wayfinding plan for Jefferson County. And on Saturday, we had our grand opening at the Garrison Station bike parking facility, which was yet another partnership between Lakewood and RTD to place bike racks at the Garrison Street Station, which is a walk-up station and currently, or did not have bike racks. And I think it was a great community event, and it was also followed by the mayor's community bike ride through Northeast Lakewood. Tomorrow, the city will be partnering in the Live, Ride, Share mobility marketplace at the Convention Center downtown. This marketplace is held to try to encourage participants to exchange ideas on mobility options that are available within the region. And Mayor Paul, I believe you're going to be leading a forum on mobility for urban cities, smaller urban cities such as Lakewood. Our Lakewood Sustains chapter deals with the city's leadership and role for sustainability, as well as air quality and climate, waste, and water. The guiding principle for Lakewood Sustains is Lakewood will be a leader in sustainability principles, practices, and education. The city focuses on its goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions citywide. It has joined the Compact of Mayors, which is a coalition of city leaders that address climate change, by pledging to reduce emissions and track the progress of that throughout the community. Lakewood has also partnered with Colorado Municipal League to develop a state report to identify what local governments can do to address climate-related risks. And Lakewood is also, I think, a leader in promoting zero waste. Our sustainability division has done a lot of work and outreach on promoting composting and recycling throughout the city's facilities. We had a green procurement fair held by our purchasing division, which tried to educate all staff on purchasing recyclable and reusable materials. And the Sustainability Division has also created a zero waste toolkit that helps educate the public as well as city staff on how we can continue to hold events that are zero waste. And the Sustainability Division has also worked to improving the air quality within Lakewood. Lakewood partnered with DRCOG during the Go-Tober month, which is held in October, with the purpose of encouraging commuters to commute to work by another mode other than the single occupant vehicle. Projects on the horizon that you'll probably be seeing or have already heard. We are developing a cityway identity and wayfinding plan. I'm sure you've heard about our Town grant that we just received for the 40 West Art Loops. We'll be doing an update to the trails assessment, and we will also be conducting a citywide housing study throughout Lakewood. And that's it, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. And you guys have been hard at work since the adoption. A lot of stuff going on, and I think there'll probably be a couple questions. So let me get to that screen. Mayor Pro Tem Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. It was a very nice presentation, Holly. Thank you. I do have a question. I know that Nanette is working on the housing study. Mm-hmm. When can we anticipate that to be ready? Do you know?
Nanette, can you address that?
We're going to be sending a memo to council this week outlining it and outlining the questions. And with that, the RFP will be going out for consultants, and they'll help guide us on the timeframes.
Oh, good. Thank you. That's particularly important in Ward 1, especially along the 13th Avenue corridor in Colfax. Also, I wanted to ask, when it's put in place that there's going to be some public art, mm-hmm. is the community that surrounds that part of that process? The reason why I'm asking, I understand that at the Garrison Street station there's going to be some places for art. But I don't know if the neighbors were actually queried if they would like to see art there, for one thing. And will they be part of selecting that art?
Sure. Kid, are you here? Could you answer this public art question?
Good evening. Kit Newland, Director of Community Resources. Generally speaking, public art is selected by the Public Art Committee. So I'm not able to tell you what the answer is in this specific example, but generally there's a committee of citizens that have expertise in different areas around, and they're from different parts of the city. So, sorry, I can look into the specifics of this and get you more information.
I'd like to see the community there queried to make sure
about whether or not they want art.
They even want the art on the bridge, and then also if they could have some input what kind of art they'd like to see, rather than it be a total citywide thing. I'd like to see the committee at least have folks on it from that neighborhood, because they're the folks using the bridge the most.
Well, I guess for a follow-up question, is this the station art's done? So are you talking about the 6th Avenue Bridge? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
And so there's been some monies allocated through the contractor and I think CDOT to do 5 of the panels underneath the bridge.
Oh, That's a different project. That's separate from the Public Art Committee project then, yeah. And I'll check into that and get back to you about how that's going to be done.
I'd like to see the neighborhood be part of that.
Okay, happy to follow up with you.
Thanks, Kim.
Councilmember Franks.
I just wanted to ask, and it may not even be relevant for this, but one of the comprehensive plan's kind of primary principles is to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of the entire Lakewood community. And I know that over in, the kind of Union area, traffic's becoming a big concern, and the comprehensive plan's somewhat silent on that. But as a person who travels the Union every day and literally avoided 2 accidents coming home last night, really sort of concerned on how this document or what associative documents feed into how do we make sure that as we're growing and keeping vital, that we are keeping safe. Again, 2 close calls, and I think it's because we don't have good turn areas, so people are doing a lot of U-turning and different things crossing lanes. So I was hoping that maybe we could speak to that for a moment.
I could probably only speak to it very generically. I do not see anybody from traffic engineering here tonight, but we can get back to you with more specifics on that as well. The comprehensive plan looks generically at transportation, understanding that we do have to plan for a variety of options. And one of the reasons why we want to encourage people to get out of their cars and to walk into the bike is to relieve traffic congestion. I do know that there's plans ultimately at some point to, and I don't know how near in the future this may be very long term, but to connect Route Street over the 6th Avenue. And I think that will relieve some of the congestion. I know that traffic engineering is always looking at traffic needs and concerns and addressing it as best they can. So unfortunately, I don't have a real specific answer for you, but I can certainly ask Dave Baskett, our traffic engineer, to get back to you with more specifics on Union if you would like.
And I think the city manager is going to weigh in just a quick second here, though. We also probably should get you, there's multiple plans that are actually part of the Union. There's the Union connectivity, and there's like 2 or 3 plans that take into consideration transportation and future transportation connections. So we should probably make sure that we get those out and they kind of fall in line with all of this. Ms. Hodson?
Thank you. I would add one more thing, and that is as a result of some of your conversations at our planning retreat, we anticipate having our Public Works Department come and speak specifically to traffic and some of our more congested corridors, including the one you mentioned, Councilor Franks, and frankly, there are several in our city that you would get an update from our Public Works Department, and it would be more specific to the issue of transportation within our city. Sure.
Councilor Harrison.
I just wanted to compliment the planning department on all of the work that has gone into this plan. First of all, it is a visioning plan, not a specifics plan. So what's wonderful about it is that there's enough vagueness in it to where we can dream big, and yet it's got goals specifically where we can accomplish them over the next 10 years. So it makes me really excited to see what happens in the next 10 years. So thank you for all your hard work. Great presentation.
All right. Anybody else? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
All right. Item number 4 is going to be an update, background information regarding Tabor. And this came out of a discussion from our retreat and then a further discussion, I guess, at Budget and Audit Committee to have a more in-depth conversation with the council. And presenting tonight is Finance Director Larry Dorr. Welcome.
Thank you, Mayor Paul and members of City Council. Once again, Larry Dorr, City of Lakewood Finance Director and City Treasurer. Well, it's a prudent decision on the part of City Council to learn a little bit more about Tabor and its impact to the city. You know, the refunds the city has made and will make have grown large, and so these numbers and the implications of them are important, and so kudos to you for having this due diligence to better understand what Tabor is and how it impacts the city. Additionally, there are new council members, and I'm excited to share some information on Tabor in whole and then talk about its impacts to the city. And for our experienced council members, of course, you've experienced this throughout our budgeting process, and this will give you a leg up on those activities that will occur later in the year. Well, in your packets for tonight, I included the text of Tabor, and it's a little over 4 pages, maybe about 1,500 words. And, you know, on its face, it's not very imposing, but the further you read and the more detail you get close to, the more complicated it gets really quickly, of course. And Tabor is the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, and it is Section 20 of the Colorado Constitution, and it was voted in statewide by voters in Colorado in 1992. You know, maybe what I should have on here is a slide about what Tabor is not, and perhaps you can dazzle your friends at your next cocktail party by saying that this has nothing to do with Mr. Horace Tabor. It has nothing to do with the Tabor Opera House in Leadville, Colorado. And Mr. Tabor, of course, was a famous mining prospector and former lieutenant governor of Colorado and a U.S. senator, but that was in the 1800s. This Tabor story starts in 1992. So what does Tabor do? It does many things. It impacts state government, county government, local districts, and of course the city of Lakewood. And my focus tonight will just be on the impacts to the city. I'm happy to try and talk about questions of how things may impact the state and other organizations, but this will relate to just city activities. First, Tabor, the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, requires an election for bonded debt, and there are exceptions to this. The city council can authorize refinancing of city debt without an election. And so there are seemingly endless exceptions to all matters related to Tabor, and I'll just try to touch on some of the most pertinent or most visible ones. Tabor requires an election for a tax increase, and you know that's always been in the City of Lakewood's charter, so that's always been there, but that was also voted in as a part of the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. Tabor requires a 3% emergency reserve. However, City Council has required a 10% emergency reserve, so we're a little more prudent there in the city. Tabor restricts multiple fiscal year obligations. And I want to just emphasize restricts. It does not prohibit them, but there are certain requirements if City Council chooses to enter into a multiple fiscal year obligation. And that's just really a complicated way of saying a long-term contract beyond 1 year. And that's why in many of the, or if not all of the agreements approved by City Council, you often see this language subject to annual appropriations. But of course, there are some exceptions, and those have been done in the past. Tabor also defines what an enterprise is, and I think the text of Tabor is fairly clear on that. It's very concise and understandable. And then indirectly, Tabor exempts those enterprises from Tabor, from the revenue limits, from the bonding requirements, and all of that. So it's not as explicit as to say that it's exempt, but all of the other restrictions of Tabor don't apply to enterprises. And then last but not least, that is probably the rest of our discussion, is that Tabor limits city revenues. And that's not real explicit. It's sort of confusing how that's described within Tabor. But that's really sort of the backbone of these big numbers and a lot of the things that you'll see in the presentation and that you've seen in our budgeting process. So first of all, city revenues are limited by a formula, a calculation. First, this CPI, or Consumer Price Index, plus local growth. If you read through the text, you'll see these two defined, and you'll see these concepts there. So the Consumer Price Index is something that's put out by the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's pretty well understood, but let me touch on it for just a moment. This is a basket of goods and services and the general increase in that same basket of goods and services over 1 year compared to the next. A lot of people think that this isn't the best measure of growth in government revenues. Reason being is prices and inflation move around in one set of parameters, and personal income, which really tends to drive our consumption and our sales tax revenues as a community, are something different. When I show you the numbers here in a moment, that'll become a little more visible. And then lastly, added to the consumer price index is local growth, and that's defined as the change in the city's assessed valuation relative to new construction minus demolition. I won't go into all the details, plus annexations. So what have those been historically? I often get that question. Are they fairly predictable? How does all of that work? How do we keep track of it? How does this impact our budgeting? So here are the numbers over the last several years, this decade. And you'll notice that in 2016, I have 1.18%, and that is actually the 2015 CPI, but we'll be using that for 2016's revenue limits. That's a function of Tabor. And you notice 1.18%, well, we've seen a lot of expansion, and a lot of personal income growth and a lot of growth in consumption. The city's sales tax revenues for 2016 have been up this year over 6% and nearly that amount last year. So there's a little bit of a disconnect, I believe, between the CPI and what happens in government revenues. Now, later this year, we'll be working up the 2016 revised budget and the 2017 budget. We have no way of knowing what the revenue limit will be because the local growth doesn't come out until mid-November, and the city's budget has to be adopted by November 1st. We'll be studying that with council in September and having an adoption in October. And of course, we don't have any idea what the 2017 limit will be either. But you can see what the history has been, and later when I show you a couple of details related to property tax, I just use the average local growth and then what we already know about the CPI, Consumer Price Index. If you look at personal income growth in the United States compared to CPI, sometimes personal income growth is 2.5 to 3.5 times larger than the CPI. A lot of goods that are in the basket of CPI are actually costing less due to technology and efficiencies in manufacturing and so forth. So it's not surprising that the CPI is somewhat disconnected from what we experience in budgeting government revenues. So we often talk about both forecasts separately in the budget process. So here are the numbers. Here are the historic trends and refunds and all of that that have happened in the last couple of years. First of all, the city's revenue is limited by its prior year collections or the Tabor limit, whichever was smaller. So in 2008, before the recession, the city's Tabor limit was $86 million. And you see here the limit ratchets down to the lower of actual collections or the limit as it was for the year. So in 2008, the actual collections were only $76 million, and that became the new base for subsequent years. Actual revenue, $82 million, amount of the refund, $1,277,000. And that's been refunded. Of course, we refunded that a few years ago. And then in 2014, Tabor, as you saw in my previous slide, allows revenue growth of 3.501%, and actual revenues grew over 8%. And so hence the difference between 84 and 89 and the refund from last year, which was approved by council and is being refunded. That's concluded. So now here are some new numbers, and we've just had these reviewed by the city's auditors, and we discussed this with the Budget and Audit Committee, which I should point out is a committee of 3 citizens and 3 council members, Gutwein, Coop, and Sharon Vincent. Beg your pardon, Councilor.
I think.
Oh, I beg your pardon, Dana.
No.
Gutwein. Let me reset. Our council's Budget and Audit Committee is council members Gutwein, Franks, and Coop. Yes. I don't know how I got those crossed up. We've certainly talked about Budget and Audit Committee a few times. Well, forgive me. So we had a meeting and discussed the most recent Tabor refund and calculations and so forth. And of course, this refund is still pending council approval, and that will happen later this year. But the allowed growth was 3.4%, actual growth 2.4%. But because of that ratcheting effect, the refund will be $4,535,000. Maybe one of the things that's throwing me off is I'm usually a person that rounds off numbers to the nearest million, but I felt it'd be better to be more precise in this slide, just so that we know the exact figures. And then, of course, this will be the total for those 3 years, just a little bit over $11 million. Thank you. I know that many in our audience are visual, so these are the same statistics, but just presented in a column graph here so that you can see visually the growth in the limit versus the growth in actual revenue subject to TABOR. So far I've talked about really the refunds that have happened in the past, but what's the outlook going forward? I talked a little bit about sales taxes a moment ago, but I want to bring it to life here in terms of property tax. So last year, when we were working up the 2016 budget, we believe that the property tax reassessment, that is the reassessment of values of property in the city, would increase 7.5%. That was a pretty aggressive forecast. We've never forecasted a reassessment of 7.5%. That's a big number. And that would mean that we'd expect budgeted revenues to come in about $574,000 higher. Of course, we don't get the reassessment, as I mentioned, until mid-November. The budget had already been adopted, and the reassessment has come in at 15%. So that means our revised 2016 property tax budget will be $1,148,000 higher. But as you saw earlier, if we take our CPI plus the average of our local growth, these revenues will be limited by 1.8% or $137,000. I also mentioned sales tax is up about 6%, so that will be there as well. So outlook appears as though there'll be additional refunds going forward in 2017 budget. Okay. In addition to the refunds and how all that impacts the budget, we also have financial complexity as an organization. And I want to bring some of those to light here that are a function of TABOR. First, grant revenues are subject to TABOR. The city can apply for grants from foundations, from the state, and others. Those grant revenues can be refunded. So the city could collect grant revenues, spend money on the program, and then have to refund those collections to taxpayers. Same with recreation revenue. One of the things we saw during the recession is there were a lot of folks that didn't travel as much or didn't take those elaborate vacations, but they did these staycations, and they spent a little bit more money on cable television and attending our recreation centers. And our recreation centers continue to be very appealing and provide a lot of value to our community. And so when we have revenue growth in our recreation centers and recreation classes and activities, that counts towards the TABOR limit as well. Also, we work very hard to drive attendance at our cultural events. And that goes not just for our cultural center, but things like cider days and other cultural events. Those revenues as well are limited by TABOR. And, not always when we have that next attendee do we have an increase in cost, but many times we do. So we need to be mindful of that and how it impacts our finances. Lastly, we have a new hotel that opened this year in Lakewood, the Hyatt across the street at the Belmar project. And the lodger's tax revenue that comes from that is also limited by TABOR and will be a part of our revised refund calculation for 2016 and going forward. Okay, next, related to economic development, the council in the past has induced private businesses to grow jobs, to grow the retail sector, et cetera, through economic development incentives. And we need to be careful with those as those revenues first go to a TABOR calculation and then can go to economic incentives. So we need to be careful not to be paying out those revenues more than once. Sponsorships, and I put Earth Day up here, and of course Earth Day we had to first postpone and then cancel in the city, but think of cider days and other events like Lakewood on Parade is another where sponsors come forward and express an interest in underwriting some of the costs of these civic events that happen in the community. Well, that sponsorship money is also revenue that's limited by TABOR. So we have to be aware of that. Police extra duty. We've seen some increases in our police extra duty activities. And what police extra duty is, a local business or even governmental operations like RTD will hire Lakewood police agents to provide security during certain events. And then the business pays money to the city, and the city makes the payroll for the police agents. That money that's paid in through extra duty is limited by TABOR and something that we need to be aware of and be thinking about. And then last, you may have seen some articles in the news recently about Amazon.com and its various subsidiaries like Zappos.com and so forth. They're now doing business in the state of Colorado. They've become licensed with the city. And if you've made any purchases since April 1st, and I won't put you on the spot because everybody's doing it, right? But if you've made some purchases and had them delivered to Lakewood, Lakewood sales tax is now collected on those purchases. And yet that will be new revenue that will also be limited by Tabor. In fact, we'll be collecting the first bits of revenue from Amazon.com on May 20th. So I'll be real eager to see its economic impact on the community and what that means to our revised budget as a city. So stay tuned for that. So those business complexities are things that we have to keep in mind as we make strategic decisions for the community in terms of funding projects and all kinds of different things. So let's see. Another thing that comes up when I talk about Tabor in the community is what has been the city's history in this area. And there have been some elections in the past that required Tabor implications and Tabor disclosure. And the first was in 1996, the voters elected to exempt a certain geography in the community from the Tabor revenue limits. And this is known as the Stevenson, Denver West, Colorado Mills area. So all of the sales taxes and property taxes, use taxes that happen in those sites are exempt from Tabor. And you'll notice that our operating fund is over $100 million, but I just showed that the city's Tabor limits are in the 80s, and that's the difference between the two. In 1999, the voters elected to have an 8-year time out from Tabor revenue limits. And so what that meant is, much like the state's referendum C, where there was a timeout from Tabor, resetting the base and so forth, that happened in Lakewood, and that was also approved. In 2005, the tax increase that was voted in as well, those revenues are exempt as well. And then in 2007, recognizing that the city could have some windfalls from open space, county open space, or other large grants, perhaps for law enforcement and so forth, that was also voted up by citizens in 2007. And yet the refund is still there. So I often get that question about the city of Lakewood and then what's gone on in other communities. And this slide is a little bit of a menagerie because it isn't just some of the neighboring cities and whether they've had these Tabor elections and so forth, but I often get the question, which is then, what is the sales tax rate, which tends to be about 60%, 2/3 thereabout of the revenues to these various communities. So I often get that. And then last but not least, I tend to get the question, what's happened statewide on this since 1992? And over 200 cities in the state have had Tabor-related questions. 86% of those questions have been approved. So with that, I hope that provides some specifics, a general overview, tells you what Tabor is not, has nothing to do with the Tabor Opera House in Leadville, but does have some very meaningful implications to the city of Lakewood in how it conducts its business every day, and then what it means in terms of refunds and what council's involvement is in that now and will be in the future. So with that, Mayor Paul, members of council, I'll be happy to answer any questions and
thank you.
Any discussion.
And it seems like we're going to have a few. And again, if it's okay with this group, maybe ask a couple questions and let's keep it moving so folks can get their questions answered. I have a clarification, and then I'll go to Councilor Gutwein. The clarification is the tax increase of 2005 actually left it the 1% exempt. Is that correct? So would we be looking at just a 2% exemption?
Well, yes, the 2005 election exempted that 1%.
That 1%, the 1% increase.
But all other taxes of the city are subject to the Tabor limits, property taxes, sales taxes, and the like. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Gutwein.
Thank you. I'll have probably several questions and comments throughout, but Larry, I was wondering if you could go back to the slide about how it's calculated. And every time I learn about this, I learn an additional layer.
This one?
Yes.
Okay.
So could you explain again where all the things that the consumer price index takes into account?
Okay, let's see. I really apologize for leaving you off the Budget and Audit Committee. That's a tough question. Let's see.
You didn't leave me
well,
off.
this is a very, it's fairly obscure. But the idea behind the Consumer Price Index is to track all of the things that ordinary consumers purchase. That includes rental costs, costs of housing, costs of energy, costs of education, of course, food, clothing, all of those kinds of things. So it's a very complicated group of costs or expenditures that consumers make and their relative prices. One of the things I talked about is with the advances in technology and manufacturing and so forth, the costs of goods have not increased at the same rate as services. Now, also, services are in the CPI, so that includes medical and a variety of different things. But this is something that's been studied, debated, reported on, and redefined for many, many decades in the United States. And I couldn't nearly do it justice. There are people who dedicated their whole career to what the CPI is and how it's calculated. But prices don't necessarily dictate what consumers spend money on. When gasoline prices, might go down, folks fill up their spending on other things. So that could show you that the consumer price index is going down, but that disposable income is the same, and people may or may not continue to buy things that don't go up in price, but drive sales taxes and perhaps the need for services in the community as well. Okay.
Thank you.
Councilor Abel.
Thank you, Mr. Doris. Good presentation. One note there to piggyback on the Councilwoman's question, isn't CPI what the inflation rate is figured on?
Yes. So the Consumer Price Index itself is general inflation, but of course different things inflate at different rates. And so, but yeah, I think
it's the average of all those things.
Yes, I think
how much they either go up or down in value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's most people would say, what is inflation? And they would refer to the CPI. Right. And by the way, I should point out that there are regional consumer price indexes, and the city uses the Denver, Boulder, Greeley CPI to be more specific.
Exactly. And it's often referred to in Tabor calculations as the inflation rate plus local growth. So, we have been refunding revenue regularly over the last 3 years.
Correct.
And it has grown from that first year to 4 or 5 times as much, or 3 or 4 times as much. And now Amazon's coming online. And Amazon will not be a new tax, but an increase of our existing tax. So if it were a new tax, I believe under Tabor, and it brought in more money than we estimated for that tax, then it would be Taborized by itself. But as figured, as Amazon's revenues come into the city, they'll just be an addition to our sales tax. Is that correct?
That's correct. Similar to any other new business that might open within the city and start paying taxes on its sales.
There were some options kind of hinted at in your presentation. I'd like to throw in perhaps we might think about a tax cut to leave some of this money at home to start with and pockets of people who could use it. Just rambling. Thank you.
Councilor Wickman.
Let's start off by repeating, I think, what I've heard, make sure I've got it. The Tabor limit that we have on our current sales tax, we have the 3-cent sales tax. And the 1 cent is not limited by Tabor, and then the 2 cents is. So essentially 1/3 of our sales tax is already debruced.
That's correct.
All right. And in addition, some of the grants are currently debruced. Okay, so just confirming what I heard. Now, the question is, economic forecast for the years ahead. You gave us the background to 2011 through 2015. What about 2015 through 2020? Can you give us some idea? Obviously, you don't know the answer, but what do you think it'll be, the inflation rate for the years ahead, and how much the Tabor refunds will probably be in those years?
I anticipate, well, we're at the very top of the business cycle, of course, and many people are speculating that, you know, there could be a flattening out or even a recession going forward. But either way, I think that the inflation rate will be smaller than the growth in personal income and, you know, population growth in the state and other things. So I think that the rate of growth of revenue will exceed that allowed under Tabor's inflation rate and local growth.
And then on that Tabor, we're using the growth factor. We've got a lot of construction going on right now. How is that going to be impacting our limit? And I'm thinking ahead, if some point in the future we were to annex Green Gables and/or out there on C470, we're looking at some potential adding to our property base. If those things were to occur, what would be the impact upon our Tabor refund situation?
Thanks for the question. Let's see. I think there are a couple of parts there. First, the limit grows by the rate of inflation and local growth, period. It doesn't there aren't any exceptions necessarily. The annexation part that comes in is, yes, that will impact the local growth. But when you consider that the city's assessed valuation is over $2 billion, the idea that any of those annexations are really going to move the needle, they're not going to move the needle at the end of the day.
How about our current construction in town?
Yeah, but those revenues, of course, will continue to drive our actual collections as a city and will, frankly, increase the refund.
Okay. And again, do you have any sort of numbers as to what we might be doing there?
I think we're going to continue on the trend where we're at. I think the refund is certainly going to stay at this current level or increase over time. Just showing you that little bit of property tax, that difference between what Tabor allows and what we think it will be, that extra, may I say, million, is going to go right onto the top of the refund because 100% of the city's property tax, except for the Stevenson-Denver West annexation, 100% of the property tax is limited by Tabor. And even just to give you an idea of the property tax, only about $250,000 of the $8 million in collections comes from the Stevenson-Denver West area. So that reassessment is going to have a profound impact. So I anticipate the refunds being $4 to $6 million a year potentially. Of course, economics being what they are, anything could change in the future.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Councilor Harrison.
Okay. Let me see if I got this straight. I'm not on the Finance Committee, and you're going to say, thank goodness, after I ask these questions. So here's how I see it. So we have a good year, and we have another good year, and we have another good year. But we're always looking back at last year's to determine how much of a refund is going out to the citizens of Lakewood. So it's really hard to figure a tax rate decrease because we're talking about a decrease from next year's income, right? So we're looking back and forward at the same time and don't have a clue where we're going to end up.
Well said. Yes. You can't forecast as I just was showing for even 2016, you can't really know the amount exactly of what the refund might be and really how to go about it. So that's why this process is essentially 3 calendar years, right? We have our collections, measurement, and then the refund after that. So we're refunding the activities from a few years ago this year. I put approved, and they're in motion, and they will be refunded. But yes, forecasting what the refund might be precisely. That's the reason I put a range around it for Councilman Wickman was, it's really difficult to understand. And in fact, we need to get all the way through the year. I mean, there are all kinds of things possible that could happen throughout the course of the year in terms of our collection. So yeah, it'd be very, very difficult. It'd be impossible to forecast how to make that precise.
Next question would be to go out and get a business, and I'll just use the one that we want in Ward 5. We want a Trader Joe, okay? We've been working on this for a while.
So does Ward 1.
Okay, we're going to get Ward 5 first, sorry. If they come in and their revenue is good enough to where again, so being successful and bringing in tax dollars is not really good under Tabor, because we're going to not be able to keep and invest that money. We always have to hand it back. Is that what you're telling me?
Yes, that's correct. And the concern would be if a Trader Joe's were to come to the city, there would be calls for service. There would be needs for service. We would be, providing snow plowing and police calls and all those kinds of things. And yet the revenue derived from the new business to pay for those services would be a general refund, except for the 1 cent of the 3 cent sales tax.
And the quandary that I'm in is because I pay taxes too. I would love if you would just send me a refund and keep enough for everybody else. But the quandary I have is this is a really tough formula for us as a council to think about, because of the fact that we can guess, you can guess, but to do a tax rate cut potentially affects us in the future as well. So thank you for your presentation. I have no idea what we're going to do. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to Mayor Pro Tem Johnson, then we'll have Shakti, Councilwoman Franks, and then go back down to Councilmember Wickman and come back down this way. You're on. You'll be after him. Yeah. It's kind of in the order of how it's come on to, so.
Very nice presentation, Larry. Thank you. I think I know the answer to this already. If a business that wanted to use some of our off-duty security were to hire them, we would have to, that would trigger part of a Tabor refund?
It would, yes. Yes, so revenue that comes to the city, except for the ones that I described, enterprises and the 1 cent of the 3 cent sales tax, all of that is subject to Tabor. Now, there are some exceptions in Tabor, federal grants and so forth, but very clearly, extra duty is restricted under Tabor.
So the fact that the business would be paying us for them, and that would be the revenue, and that would trigger. It's good to know. Thank you.
And so the money, each dollar comes out of City Hall twice, once for the tax cut or refund, and then once to pay the police agent that provides the extra duty.
So as a follow-up to that question, is there a transit agency in town that we contract with that pays for our off-duty agents, and essentially we refund that money?
The Regional Transportation District, of course, uses Lakewood police agents, but many businesses across town, I can't remember the annual revenues, but it's in the multi-hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And of course, to the extent that it stays the same, we would refund the same. If it were to go up, then more would be refunded if it went up more than inflation.
Just to follow up, so then essentially we're providing the service free.
Well,
or closer.
The amount of the refund doesn't go back to the business that 100% that paid for the extra duty. It goes back to, all of the taxpayers of the community. So, yeah. But at the end of the day, we're
But that could be more clear, though. I think I understand where she's going with that.
Yeah.
We are essentially, now RTD is costing the transportation district to pay those dollars.
Beg your pardon, yes.
And they're paying us, but we're essentially passing it through back to the taxpayers.
Yeah.
So they're carrying the extra load. We're carrying the extra load. Shakti?
Thank you. It was educational. So part of what I find confusing about the formula is it seems like what are our increased costs would be kind of a central question, and that would have to do with like how many people there are, and among other things. So do we think that that would be reflected in the CPI or in the local growth? Because the local growth would tell you if the property values have gone up, but not if, like, I don't know, people are living with each other or...
Yeah, let's see. Regardless of what's happening in the community and what the need for services are, or whether or not there's, a flood in the community or whatever might occur, Tabor doesn't address expenditures. Tabor indirectly controls expenditures by restricting revenue. That's the crux of Tabor. So if the swimming pool springs a leak and the community needs to replace that, it doesn't have anything to do with expenditures. Tabor is a function of revenue. It restricts revenue. And I think for some of the other governments, either the state or the school district, and forgive me, I can't claim to be an expert on how it impacts those entities, they do have some population factors, but the city's population does not impact Tabor at all. And I don't think it would necessarily impact the Denver, Boulder, Greeley inflation rate either.
Okay. Then I like Councilor Johnson, there were some of the examples you gave that were sort of surprising in terms of like the police extra duty or the underwriters to an event or even the ticket costs. So I guess the question would be, when can you use an enterprise? What are the restrictions around that? I imagine some of it is whether it's a big enough phenomena to justify it, but because like the police extra duty, it sort of only tangentially involves the city, and yet the city ends up paying all the cost because we're up on the limit, and more of these issues come up because we're up on the limit. So,
yeah, let's see. I'm glad I included the text of Tabor, and maybe now is the time to point to that. On page 1, section 2, subset D is the one-liner, for lack of a better description, that defines enterprise. And as you see this, it has this threshold of 10% of its annual revenue, in grants from all Colorado state and local governments combined. So that therein lies the enterprise. It's pretty well understood. There are some accounting rules around what constitutes a business, but it tends to be this concept of water district. Denver Water is an enterprise and things like that.
So if we had an event that was paid for through ticket sales, could that be an enterprise?
What we find is that oftentimes the cost...
Becoming an enterprise is too large.
Right. So, for example, if you take our cultural center, more than... It's actually its own fund, but it's receiving more than 10% support from government as a whole, and so therefore it wouldn't qualify as an enterprise.
Right,
so.
Okay. Yeah, if you come back to me.
Yes, I'll come right back to you. Just to clarify, do we have essentially 2 enterprise funds, the golf courses and stormwater?
The city actually has 4 enterprises. Okay. So we do in Northeast Lakewood have the
water and sands are put into that. Okay.
Water, sewer, golf, and stormwater. Okay. Yeah, those are the city's 4 enterprises, and they are very traditional enterprises.
Which grants are debruced and which aren't?
So let's see. Under Tabor itself, federal grants have never been a part of Tabor. That's been in the constitutional amendment since 1992. And then Lakewood voters chose to exempt grants for law enforcement, cultural activities, and streets. And then also all open space revenues have been debruced. And forgive me, I should explain what debrucing means, because undoubtedly there might be a person or two in the audience that doesn't know. So one of the authors of Tabor is a person named Douglas Bruce. And so oftentimes when there are changes to Tabor, people use this expression, debrucing. So thank you. I meant to make that a part of my presentation, so I want to share that with the audience. So yes, those are some of the grants, but we do have grants from local foundations. We have to consider that. Also grants from the state that are not for those purposes that we have to really be sure and review and understand. And oftentimes the grant application itself will ask if the city's revenues are limited by Tabor and so forth. So that's an important function of that.
Did you just say there what kinds of grants are still affected by Tabor?
Yes, so it depends on the source of the grant, if it's not from the federal government, and then if it's not used.
Will you list cultural roads? What didn't you list?
Well, the city receives grants from a lot of different sources. You've seen the pages in the budget book. It's at least 50, 60 items long and more than a couple of pages. So the city can receive grants for all kinds of things. As you know, we have early childhood education and preschool activities. We have recreational activities that wouldn't fall under those law enforcement, cultural, and streets.
Okay. And then the way I understand sort of the difference between, if we have the option of cutting taxes or a refund, it strikes me that some of the logic behind a refund is that that's the more conservative approach, because if then you won't have to raise taxes if the economy turns down, that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yes, I should address that. Interestingly, council approved a tax cut via the last refund. So by doing nothing and letting Tabor just sort of work, for lack of a better description, that leads to a tax cut. So in November, October, City Council approved the refund and cut property taxes in the community. So doing nothing leads to that tax cut, and it's very precise. The amount of the tax cut is equal to the amount of the refund, and that's it. And so that's sort of the going forward do nothing option, that tax cuts that property tax cut will continue to stay in place until the refund reaches a zero. So it does happen sort of retroactively is the idea. So, but most definitely the property tax is less than 2 mils, and it was nearly 4.7 mils on a standard basis. So City Council cut taxes via that refund.
Are we waiting to share broader thoughts on Tabor?
Because we have quite a few questions.
Technical questions, sure.
Yeah. Councilmember Franks.
Kind of some context questions. Since we talked earlier about, I think that Tabor said you had to have 3% of the funds. What is our general fund currently at? What's the trend on that? And where do we sit in relation to our 10% that you mentioned?
It's much higher than 10%, and the idea of the 10% is that it would be for an emergency to occur in the community. And of course, a week from today, the council will be using a lot of reserves if it approves an ordinance and so forth, and I'd have to recalculate it, but it's certainly higher. It's definitely in the 30% territory. And, we're submitting operating budgets that are balanced. Revenues equaling expenditures. So setting aside the idea that council might want to use reserves for sidewalks and other things as it has in the past, it could stay the same or decrease. It'll certainly decrease for this coming ordinance, and of course anything is possible in the budget sessions, but I would think on an operating basis that revenues should equal expenditures and they should stay in that range.
So what's our general fund currently at, roughly?
In the 30% plus.
What, a number, like
30 million.
30 million? And, okay, and that's about 30%. just a couple more comments, I guess, regarding either the refund or the tax one. I know that we've done the disbursements. I think it was stormwater originally, or at least that's the first time I noticed it, and then property tax. And the only comment I wanted to make is that kind of disproportionately then takes the refund and puts it towards, property owners, out-of-state property owners, and people like next to me who rent and pay an awful lot in goods and services. So I think that's a general, I know that's not, that's a construct issue that Tabor doesn't speak to how these refunds are done, but I just find that some of those mechanisms disproportionately reward certain folks in our community and maybe don't reward everybody in the community for the excesses. So that was more just a comment.
That is one of the struggles of Tabor, is that really any method is accepted. It's right there in the first paragraph. And it's one of the things that our policymakers, our council members struggle with in approving a refund, is how to do that. Even amongst the property owners, people move to town, they move out of town, and it's very difficult. But we also want to do it in the most efficient way possible and not spend money on overhead and postage and other things to make refunds. But it is a struggle. Yeah. Mayor?
There's a follow-up question. Is that okay? From Councilor Abel? Ms. Franks? Yeah, okay.
A follow-up comment, and it's very well said, Councilwoman Franks. Property taxes make up how much of our budget? Our revenue?
7 or 8%, somewhere.
And sales tax?
2/3.
2/3. So we're returning money to about 7% of citizens when the largest part of that Tabor overage is paid by people who may not own property.
Well,
so,
let's see. The contribution.
Equity, I'm just addressing the equity there. We're talking property tax. It brings in 5%, and we give them a tax break. But then the largest part of our revenue is from sales taxes, and it's paid in large part by the people, Barb's neighbors, who are renters, and they don't get the sales tax refund. So that just seems inequitable to me. Also, and I know there may be some liability questions or other insurance questions or risk management questions, but in many places when police do extra overtime work for vendors, the vendor pays them. Why doesn't RTD just pay them directly? Yeah. And any other outside agency, why are we acting as more or less a employment broker?
That's something that should be considered for sure in terms of operations.
Well, and it would reduce, if this is a dramatic portion of our Tabor overage, that would eliminate a large portion there. That is revenue that is not taken out on, we don't get credit for because the expense goes elsewhere.
We'd have to really think about what it means for a police agent to attempt to do those kinds of things. I think there'd be some difficulty and perhaps some resistance on the part of a police agent making those arrangements and collecting those funds and receiving pay. That's certainly a consideration, though, that should be looked at.
If I were to do overtime counseling for some other group, I imagine they would pay me instead of the city paying me. So, thank you.
Councilor Goodwine.
Can I do a
follow-up?
Okay. So property tax is 7% of the revenue, but I don't think that means it comes from 7% of the people. I think it's a much larger percentage of the people. So that's not what you're saying. That makes sense. I just wanted to clarify that. And it has to do with the rate of the tax, not the number of people. So.
Well, and I'd just say that's the complex part of sales taxes. We don't know who's also paying our sales taxes for folks that don't even live in the city and are just donating the sales tax. I mean, this is not an easy subject by any means, and I think it would be hard pressed to say if we asked our agents to become independent contractors to get overtime, that might be an issue that I could definitely see as far as protection and insurance and different things along those lines. So, Councilor Gutwein, We're getting over that way to the right, I promise.
Thank you. Mr. Dwyer, I was wondering if you could provide some insight on how on the kind of level of funding we would need to do some of the projects that we have waiting. Like, for example, one that came up earlier was about Union Station and some of the infrastructure projects. I know there's a lot of parks and that type of project that we have people coming in on a weekly basis asking us to complete these projects. And could you give us a picture of, we have our operating expenses, but what are we looking at in order to accomplish all the things that people would like to see done?
Well, let's see. I'm not the best person to answer the question. Certainly, the crux of the services provided to the community are police, parks and community resources, and our public works departments. I think my peers in those departments were probably better equipped to tell you about a list of needs or projects, but I don't have any of that prepared. But you can recall from our budget sessions that there are needs for all types of infrastructure and programming and variety of other things that are out there for sure.
Thank you. And could you also, actually, I'll save this one for a moment. Thank you.
And maybe we can circle back after there's questions, and if there's a decision to where this council wants to go next, that's when we would try to get that information. But if you just threw out the Route Street Bridge is like $9 million, if we were going to hire, more agents, I mean, we could easily get to 30, 40 million pretty fast with just things that are in our view of what we would like to do. Do you want to comment on that?
I was just going to agree with you, and it depends on what you want. We can spend across the board. If you think about playground replacements and you wanted to increase the frequency of replacing those, each one of those, a playground, for example, can cost between $200,000 and $400,000. And think about sidewalks, and there's just a multitude of things: park acquisition, park development, park renovation, and we can go on and on. It depends on what you need, what you'd like to see, where your priorities are.
So can I ask a follow-up then? So what would, just as an example, I know we have a lot of the city that doesn't have sidewalks. What's a ballpark of our unfunded?
80 million.
80 million.
This is the last number that I saw for unfunded sidewalk projects.
Okay. And then for the Union and Alameda, that was, or you mentioned Route Street, I guess. So those are 9 million, and then Barb, would it be about 15, 20 million for the Union?
It's hard to just kind of throw these numbers out. I think, again, if this group decides they want to have further conversation, I think we would direct.
I guess I'm just trying to make a point that we have a tremendous amount of things that we would like to see, that we hear our citizens coming in and asking for, that are quite expensive, and I think that should be a part of the conversation when we're talking about.
Councilor Wickman.
All right, my sense from the constituency is they like the philosophical concept of Tabor, limiting growth of government. They like the idea of getting some money back, and I'm looking for ways to get some money back to the folks. But there is some concern about some of the technical issues. Whenever I hear about Tabor, that people say they don't like the ratchet effect. I wonder if it'd be possible to maybe put something on the ballot this year to maybe eliminate the ratchet effect, and possibly some of these. The bit about like the police agents. On the one hand, I realize it's not a big number. It's not going to make a big impact. But on the other hand, it's a technical change that people might be interested in cleaning up our Tabor situation. Speculation on that?
So essentially maybe like a Ref C for the city of Lakewood.
I'm trying to remember what Ref C was. But technical issues as opposed to we don't want to keep their money. I think that's pretty clear. But, as far as cleaning up things, I think people would be interested in doing that.
Thank you.
May I have a follow-up to Dave's question? I want to ask Dave a question. Then if we did that, Dave, what would you use as the basis?
Well, off the top of my head, I guess I'd start with where we're at right now. 'Cause what I heard you saying was that with that ratchet, you always have the danger. I think you and I as economists are probably thinking in terms of the economy is due for a downturn here pretty soon. So if that were to be true, then we might be running into ratchet again. And we might want to say is in the future, if we have ratchet situations, no more ratchets. Now this is our baseline, and we'll use this as our baseline for now on.
Yeah, on this slide here, I mentioned that in 2008, that the base, or the red number, if you could, the limit was 86 million. Well, by now it would be nearly 100 million, and this $11 million in refunds would have never been made. We can't go back. Those refunds have been authorized by council, and they've been refunded, all but the most current one. And that will have to happen sometime this year. But yes, it's quite evident that the difference being is Tabor is year by year, and it always uses the lower number. And it's not a 10-year trend or a 5-year trend and so forth. So
then we could take out some of the things like the extra police duty, technical problems, clean it up.
Technical questions, yes. Mm-hmm.
For a follow-up to that, though, what would something like that look like? I mean, what would that question, and again to Councilor Harrison's ask, where would that benchmark number be?
I don't quite know. I'd have to really do some technical research, see if anybody else has done that, and get some legal advice, quite honestly, to make sure that that's even feasible. I couldn't quite say right off the bat. I'm not aware of another government that's done that. But certainly this reset and the timeout that the city did just that. It reset the bases and sort of eliminated that ratchet effect in the early 2000s. That was the 8-year timeout that was voted in at that time. So I'd be glad to look into that further, and we could have some other experts in the legal field provide some background from the city attorney's office.
Well, and we still have quite a few more questions, I think. Councilor Wickman, does that satisfy you for now?
Yeah.
Okay. Councilor Vincent, I told you we'd get there. Sorry.
I think most of my questions have been asked, but I do have, can you go back to the slide that talked about those tax items that counted against that were specific?
Sure. Well, there are a couple
yeah, there
of
you
them
go.
here. So they're
okay.
The two
so
slides.
there's one there, I think that talked about lodging taxes.
There you go.
Lodgers
tax growth.
Tax growth. Mm-hmm. Who's that set by?
Let me first explain what the lodger's tax is to make sure that it's clear to the audience. So if a person stays in a hotel room in the city of Lakewood, they pay the city's 3% sales tax, and they pay a 3% lodger's tax. And that 3% lodger's tax is credited to the Economic Development Fund of the city and is used for various economic development purposes. All of that lodger's tax revenue is limited by Tabor. Well, most hotels experience some inflation, from year to year. But when you add an entirely new hotel to the city's stock of hotels, that's a pretty big jump. Unlike a city the size of Denver might have a new hotel and not have a noticeable spike in revenue, the city will experience that. So forgive me if I didn't quite answer the question. I think it was who sets that. The voters voted in the lodger's tax in the 1990s. The voters created the lodger's tax and the purpose for which the funds would be used, and it's a tax on the books just like the city's sales tax, use tax, and other taxes.
So specifically, Lakewood voted in a 3%.
Lakewood citizens voted in a 3% lodger's tax, correct.
Okay, so we have I'm trying to think of economic incentives. I mean, that's something that is one of those things that you can use as an economic incentive, a lodger's tax, to reduce that to businesses who do book hotels, et cetera. But what you're saying is for that to be an exempt and to be part of something that could be an incentive, we'd have to go back to the taxpayers and have them decrease it.
Right.
Which would be an added expense because they'd have to vote on it.
Technically speaking, it would be. And also the thing to bear in mind with lodgers is they don't tend to be Lakewood citizens, right? People who are visiting the community for personal and business reasons. They're the people paying the lodger's tax. Yeah.
And correct, yeah, I understand that. I just know that it can get very high, and sometimes the cities, in order to try to lure more people in, will do something around that, and because then it's less expensive to book your hotel in Lakewood than it is in Arvada, let's say, or something. So I was just curious about that, how that came about. So that's all.
Councilor Harrison? No? Mayor Pro Tem Johnson?
Thank you, Mayor. Couple things. I'm intrigued by Councilman Weichmann's idea to try and tweak the Tabor without just debrucing. I like that. I'd like to see how we could play with that. I do have a question. What is the cost to the city to do a Tabor refund?
Well, the most recent refunds that City Council has approved have effectively been zero cost. There's no postage, no checks issued. Of course, there's some staff time involved in calculating the Tabor refund and filling out the proper paperwork with the county, and there's some administrative costs, but there haven't been any direct hard costs, mailings or notices, those kinds of things. So, and our goal in presenting that as an option to council is to try to do this in the least expensive way possible.
Okay. The way I understand it, we've got 40 million in reserves. And I heard the mayor say that we have about 80 million in things that, like a wish list. Why aren't we using some of that money and starting to do some of that? What are we waiting on?
Well, I think City Council has approved some use of quite a lot of the use of reserves in the last 3 or 4 years. I don't have the budget in front of me, but I'm trying to think of just in this last budget cycle, Council authorized the use of reserves for, I think, $800,000 for playground equipment. I think $1 million. Well, maybe I think there's $2 million in sidewalks. Thank you. So the council has authorized the use of some reserves, and we'll be using reserves for settlement, and we'll be using reserves. I think again in this coming budget process, but that's of course a prerogative of City Council is how much reserves for what purpose and so forth. But I think the amount used is approaching 10 million over the last 3 or 4 years, and I'd be happy to bring back a list of the use of the reserves that have been approved in the various budgets of the last years. Okay,
Larry, just so that I understand this, we as a city philosophically have tried to keep 10%. We have to have 3% in reserves, but we try to keep it at 10%.
Council has a budget policy that's requiring of itself a 10% emergency reserve. I think that's prudent and a wise number because 3% of the state budget, which is why this exists, is hundreds of millions of dollars to plan for a statewide emergency. For the city, a 10% reserve can account for a fairly meaningful disaster, emergency, whatever the case may be.
What is 10%?
So it's 10% of the city's operating budget, or a little over $10 million for an emergency.
So we are about close to 30 million over?
A little bit less than that for emergencies. But of course, council has taken the view that we're going to have economic ups and downs. I've often spoken of the idea that the city works a little bit like a self-employed household. It's difficult to predict the revenues for the city, and so if there's an economic recession, we don't want to have to decrease the number of police agents, decrease the number of services to the community. So the idea is that during a recession, we could use reserves to smooth out those ups and downs in revenue. And we've certainly seen those. I've seen those as finance director between September 11th disaster when revenues dropped 8 or 9% or more. We saw that during the recession last decade, and eventually that will happen again. The city, for operating purposes, each decade in the city's history has needed to use reserves to smooth out those economic ups and downs.
Help me, because this isn't my field. If 10 million is 10% basically, is that correct? And we are at basically 40 million, and we've got needs out there, it seems that we are being extremely conservative if we've got some things out there that we need to be looking at. I guess I'm not understanding why, if we've got some serious issues, why we're not addressing them with that 30 million.
I think
maybe that's excuse me, Mr. Doerr, maybe that's a policy question. Maybe I can help answer that. In my tenure, in the 8 years when I was on council, I think I came in around 20 million we had in reserves. And then we started to hit a tremendous downturn. And we were very cautious and really tried to ride out the downturn. We didn't know what was going to happen. We were in the Great Recession. We didn't know where we were going to go. We wanted to make sure we were very conservative. And then as we were moving forward, there were some big projects on the radar. And those projects are not on the radar anymore. So that'll be more of a policy discussion as we near budget season as to what those priorities should do. And I imagine it's safe to say you could question or ask every different member what they think the right amount of reserves is. Some might think we have way too many, we're just right, or we need more. So I think that's a discussion that is a valid one as we move forward. But that's why we got to such a high number, was because we had a major project on the books that the city was looking at going forward with at that time.
I have a little bit of a follow-up, because basically this discussion kind of puts you in the direction of debrucing, but yet we need to have some kind of discussion regarding when we have such hefty reserves, and then why would we debruce? Or, like I say, this isn't my field. I'm just kind of...
I think, as the mayor pointed out, it's a holistic policy level discussion. I'm wanting to just provide the most recent Tabor refund and sort of the mechanics about how Tabor works, and I think all those things are interrelated.
Shakti.
So you and I have had pretty extensive conversations about the reserve and why we have that reserve. And one of the questions is, for example, at the state level, they have a much lower reserve. And why is it appropriate for the state level to have a much lower reserve? And what I took out of those conversations is that because we only get 7% of our funding from property tax, and the vast majority of our funding comes from sales tax, we have a much more volatile revenue stream. And so we need to have larger reserves to be just as secure as they are at the state level, because they have a much more stable revenue stream. Does that sound right?
Well said, yes.
And I think that reserves vary in different cities, but we are in sort of the ballpark. My memory is that the county has a much higher percent of reserves. And it has been my thought that we don't want to go much above 30%. And if we do, then we definitely want to invest back into our community, but that it makes sense to have a safety net for that volatility over time. So that's the reserves. Then I'm curious if you might have said this, but if we didn't have the ratchet effect at all, so we had Tabor, but we were not affected by the ratchet effect, what would be our Tabor limit now? So right now it's 80-something is the, if our revenues are over 80-something. I agree, I saw it previously too.
There we go.
So if our revenues are over 87,000, then we return them. 87 million, right?
Right. Correct.
And if there had never been a ratcheting down, what would it be?
Let me try to explain the ratchet a little bit differently. So if in 2016 actual revenues go down to 85 million, so the 91 that's at the bottom, if we carry that forward to 16, if it goes down to 85, our limit will go down to 85. That's that ratchet effect discussion. And then the limit only increases by that inflation amount each year. What the ratchet or eliminating that would do is we would always take the higher number from the previous period and kind of carry that forward. By the way, if you did that, the idea is that, yes, that would carry it going forward, but everything that's happened in the past is what it is and is done in terms of refunds. And it could continue a refund for the coming years.
I guess that's the sort of the underlying question, because part of, the way that one does their budget, right, is that you have savings, and when it gets really tight, you use those savings when you need to. But then when things get, you start making more money in your household or whatever, then you can increase your savings, or you can invest in landscaping or whatever the priority is for the household. So what's happened to us is we had a recession where we were not able to invest in some things that are large, outstanding issues. And so what I'm saying is, if we went back, because I think Councilor Wickman's point is valid, that there might be a structural issue with Tabor where the ratcheting doesn't make sense, but I don't understand why it would just be moving forward. And so if we went back and said, okay, if we hadn't ratcheted down, what would our level be? And you had a graph some years ago where you showed what city spending would be without the ratchet effect and what it actually is with the ratchet effect, and they're pretty dramatically different. Mm-hmm. So anyway, if we continue on that discussion, which I think makes some sense, and it sounds kind of like the state level, what is it called, referendum C, something with a C in it, I'd be interested in those kind of numbers. And then, I wondered about the lodger's tax, and it goes into economic development. Why can't that be an enterprise? And I guess I want to clarify here. What's important to me in this conversation is that we are giving the community the opportunity to think about these outstanding needs. And I remember knocking on voters' door, and they were like, "I'll vote for you if you can fix the sidewalks out there," and we can't fix all the sidewalks. And if that's something people want, these are numbers that we all need to think about. So that's just sort of where I am as a background. So why can't that be an enterprise, or could it be?
Okay, thank you. Let's see, earlier you mentioned the concept of, you were describing investment and your income goes down and things like that. And that is essentially the case. The city can't recover from a recession back to the level that it was before the recession without just basic inflation. So I just want to add on and confirm your thinking on that. And then just the very basics of accounting. A tax is something that you don't have a choice to pay. You have to pay a tax. I have a choice whether I want to consume water or engage in some other enterprise activity, or I'm receiving something directly for the payment that I'm making. So it would be like turning the general fund into an enterprise where we collect sales tax and provide police services. The parallel is there for collecting a lodger's tax that has to be paid. The person doesn't get something directly for that. We provide economic development.
The benefit
services.
goes to someone else, not to them.
Correct. Okay. That's sort of the backbone of what an enterprise is.
I understand.
Councilor Wickman.
Okay, going beyond the questions at this point, Ramey, raised some good questions about how much do we need, and I've struggled with that over the years, but I've kind of come to my answer at this point. 6 months ago, we said that we had $25 million to buy that land at the Fed Center. So I think the answer is that we've got $25 million that we can use for various projects around the city. That was a combination of monies. But anyway, to answer Ramey's questions, I think we ought to look at taking that $25 million and using it for these various projects. Now, going to the issue at hand, the refund. I'm certainly not opposed to the property tax, and that's fine. But we thought about some other alternatives. And I guess what I'm thinking is, we did that stormwater fee offset in previous years. I've often thought in terms of, maybe some sort of decline in some of our fees at rec centers and stuff like that. Where are we thinking about doing the mechanism to make this happen while, of course, keeping it cheap?
Let's see, a couple of things. Just thinking back to the Fed Center piece, I think 25 million was to be borrowed, and that wasn't going to be the use of reserves. But I'd have to look back at my notes on that. But I do recall it being a little different. And then related to the mechanism, one of the thing that makes property tax so unique, like the stormwater, is we know exactly how much will be received. We know what the assessed valuation is in the community for the given year, and we know what the mill levy is, and we can calculate to the dollar the amount of the refund. If we were to reduce recreation fees as it was, we wouldn't quite know if we're giving enough of a tax cut, or too much, or whatever it might be. So that's a real tough one.
Okay, but how about the stormwater fee?
Stormwater fee, we do know. So we know that the amount of impervious square feet that each property has, we know that the rate and so forth. But so it works similarly, but we can't. The amount of the fee isn't equivalent to the tax cut necessary. Under these numbers.
How about doing a combination of a portion towards the property tax fee and then the remainder towards property tax?
Those are options that council could discuss as it's approving the tax cut or the refund as it was for 2015 Tabor. Mm-hmm.
Councilor Harrison.
I was just going to mention that a good financial planner would always recommend to your family finances to have a 25% of your annual income set aside in an emergency fund plus investments. Now, we've got a little bit more than that, but that's because we've been very conscious about what we're doing. So I'm not sure that I want to add a whole bunch more to the reserve, but I have no problems whatsoever with the $40 million that we've got in there. I think that's good business. But any personal financial planner would recommend at least 25%. So I don't have a problem with what we've got in there.
Councilor Gutwein.
I wasn't sure how fast you were going to get back over here. I guess are we looking to come up with a plan of what we want to do, or what?
I would like to get through all the questions that council members might have. I'd also like to get an understanding of the time frame. If council were to move forward, there's obviously a time frame if it were to happen this election. And then I'd like to get next steps as to, I think I'm hearing two different things. One has to do with the ratchet, and the other has to do with potentially exploring a refund based with potential pockets of where that money would go. That's kind of what I'm saying.
Then I guess I'd like to offer a third, because I think Councilman Wickman said something along the lines of that the constituents want them, they want the money back, and that's what the constituency wants. But I'm not sure that I agree with that, and that's what I've been hearing in the community. And I think that it's my understanding that these questions in the past have gone to the citizens, and I think it might be appropriate to ask people what they would like, and as a possibility.
Well, to that point, I mean, that's what option 2 would be. But considering I don't know if we could ask the citizens, give 10 different things for them to vote on where they'd want their money. We'd have to present them with, this is where, if you de-Bruce, this is where that would go. So that is one of the options. The two options that I've heard is the ratchet, timeout, and then the second one be going to the voters and saying refund with, this is where the money would go.
Can I interrupt, Mayor, as well? So today's May 16th, and there are a couple of questions that we need to work on. And so it seems as if we tentatively put on June 6th a follow-up conversation. And that would be a time when we can answer those questions before you decide if indeed this is something for the ballot or not, or some hybrid, whatever that might be. So we weren't sure if we were going to keep the date of the 6th. That's certainly up to you, but it's penciled in if that's something you want to do, and we would come back with answers to your questions, the ones that we can. So just a thought.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Johnson.
Thank you. Again, this isn't my field, but when I hear us talk about the potential of going into another recession, and of course, at that point, our sales tax would drop, right? Okay. But if we're in a recession, so are the people. And it seems to me that they need the money back. Or I'm kind of struggling with the concept of us having the recession and not the people, you know. Particularly since we keep talking about Lakewood being a community that is aging. I'm just throwing that out.
But if I could, I mean, typically in the recession years, the refund wouldn't be on the table, right?
There certainly wasn't a recession in 2015, 14, or 13 that led to these surpluses, these refunds, and so forth. And of course, any speculation on a recession would be just that.
Councilor Shakti.
So I hear your concern about if there is a recession, we don't want to be asking people to pay more taxes. And my understanding is that in the year when there was a recession, we would expect the tax revenue to go down because people would be buying less stuff. And then the issue is that in the subsequent year, if then there was the economy improved, we would then have to stay at the lower level that taxes were collected at. So it's not about the year when there's the recession, it's about the next year when there isn't. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So, since we have the 6 lined up, would it be fair with this council if we did 3, if we got back to the 3? 1 being nothing. Nothing. We just move forward with the way we are. 2 would be getting more information on the ratchet or putting a limit on where we go. And then 3 would be an ask to be exempted with the caveat that whatever that ask is, those monies would be put in certain areas. And I mean, I think we probably know those public safety, parks, and infrastructure. Am I missing an area that somebody would like to see added? So is that fair direction for staff to maybe come up with some of these ideas and what that would look like? I know, I mean, we could have a refund and we could see $5 million returned if we debruced for 1 year and then we're done. So it's hard to say that we'd be able to fund long-range plans based on this. But I think it's also fair to say if we're going to go to the voters, this is where that money would go, and they'd be assured that that'd be the case. So are those three options acceptable? Yes. Councilor Abel.
What would that refund amount to per household, per whatever? If we do it on stormwater again, if we refund $4.535 million to everyone that gets a stormwater bill, what would that be a piece?
Excuse me, just off the top of my head, doing the numbers, maybe $30, $40, somewhere in there.
I won't get rich. Thank you.
Councilor Shakti.
I just wanted to add some of what Councilor Wickman was talking about, if there are other little technical fixes for these situations that just don't quite seem right, that they could be a part of the conversation too.
So is that enough is that clear direction for staff? Can we start to build off of that? Is that acceptable?
Yeah, let me reiterate, please. So we will come back with a follow-up study session on June 6th. And we have kind of these 3 options that we'll talk about. The first one is do nothing, no change. We'll just issue refunds and continue on. Number 2 is kind of that hybrid to talk about some changes that could be made, like impacting the ratchet effect, maybe exempting some special kind of expenses. And what was and something else you just said. I'm sorry.
The third one was
No, there's one more thing in the number 2, kind of that hybrid. And the third would be sending it to the voters, full exemption with those earmarks, if you will. So that would be public works type things, streets, that kind of stuff, community resources, parks, those kind of improvements. And the third, of course, would be police. So those are the 3. Do nothing, full exemption, and then a middle, which is a hybrid.
Mayor Pro Tem Johnson.
I like the idea of waiting until June the 6th because it gives us an opportunity as counselors to get input from our constituents at our ward meetings, and they actually might come up with something else that we haven't even thought of.
Mr. Dorr, as always, thank you very much for your time and information. It's much appreciated.
Thank you. I'll be back on June 6th with some assistance, no doubt, and we'll continue the discussion, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Council, for that discussion and some good conversation and good ideas. So I'm going to go to reports, and we've been kind of busy. So last week, some of the folks up here were able to attend the police awards, which was a really nice ceremony to see a lot of our officers honored for things that you don't even ever hear about in the news. And it's just really touching every year to see how heroic our men and women are, and from saving people's lives to rushing into danger. And I just got to do a shout out to Moose Chavez, who runs with a young man named Luke from Alameda High School, who's paraplegic and nonverbal. And prior to him going up, he was very agitated. Luke was very agitated. And when Moose got him on stage, Moose was just able to calm him in a way that was incredible. And the Lakewood Police made young Luke an honorary police agent. So it was very special. And last but certainly not least, we had a new Hall of Fame member inducted into the Lakewood Police Hall of Fame, and that's Chief Kevin Paletta. So congratulations to Kevin, and thank you for many years of great service. I had a wonderful bike ride. We started out with about 50 people on Saturday, and which was amazing because it was cold. I tried to dial in warm weather, and it didn't quite work, but we had a great turnout, and again, the Lakewood Police were there to keep us safe, and we cut the ribbon at the Garrison Station and had a really good time. So look forward to another one of those coming in September, probably September 17th. And the last but certainly not least was the Colfax Marathon. And thank you to all of the folks that participated, all the neighborhoods and volunteers who got out there and made the Lakewood experience, as always, one of the best. When the folks come to Sheridan and see West Metro with the big fire engines out and the Kiwanis clubs handing out oranges and drinks, it's just fantastic. So I was grateful to be a part of that, and thank again our public safety folks too for keeping those runners safe. So it was a big weekend, big week. Shakti. Sure.
Thank you. Just a reminder to council about the, if there's something you want to put on the agenda, fill out one of the forms. Also, I had the opportunity to visit Foothills Animal Shelter and take a little tour. And it was very cool to learn that they do, and we do as a community, such a good job of adopting animals from that shelter that they're able to take animals from some of the surrounding areas that have a lot less success getting animals adopted. So a good news story.
I just want to follow up on that, on the request. So everybody has been forwarded a form, and we had been keeping track of people's ideas. But it's important because we heard that folks want to be able to put it into their own information. So please, if you need to be refreshed on what you might have had an idea about, we have those, but please fill those out in your own vernacular, however you want that filled out and what you want to address. Mayor Pro Tem Johnson.
Thank you. Well, last week I had the pleasure of representing you at the Senior Heroes Awards. And I think that there was only one person from Lakewood, Loretta Quigley. who volunteers at St. Bernadette's. And I would just like to say that I'm very appreciative that our community actually acknowledges and recognizes our seniors. It is a generation that has a great deal of wisdom. They survived the Depression. They survived World War II, and we can learn a lot from them. And I'm appreciative that that's out there. That's all.
Ms. Gutwein?
No report.
Ms. Franks? Mr. Coop?
Yes, I'd like to thank you, the Mayor, and city staff, and especially the police department for the bicycle ride on Saturday. It was fun. Thanks for everybody that came out on what could be considered a chilly day to go for a bike ride, but it was very fun and very informative, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for joining us. Mr. Abel?
Ward 1 meeting Saturday at Holy Shepherd Lutheran Church, 920 Kipling, from 9 to 11 a.m. We will have the president of the school board there to discuss their facilities report and a follow-up, master plan, facilities master plan. And we will have a follow-up on the consolidated mutual audit done by TZA Water Engineers.
Harrison.
Yes. Also this Saturday, Ward 5 will be having our meeting at the Bear Valley Church at 1001. I didn't put enough zeros, 3 zeros, West Jewel Avenue. And Nanette Nealon, our Deputy City Manager, will be there to give us a wonderful presentation on economic development, how it affects us, rooftops and retail. So I can hardly wait. Thank you.
Mr. Roybal.
Just a quick reminder, we are not going to be having our regular Ward 3 meeting this month, and instead we're going to be at the Lakewood High School with the World War II Veterans Memorial. Just wanted to remind everybody, May 28, 10 a.m. at the new Lakewood High School. Thank you.
Ms. Vincent.
Yeah, I just have a little bit of a different perspective on the bike ride. I had to explain to my neighbors, why are the police chasing all those bicyclists down 13th? So that's it.
Oh, you're always good to get us laughing. I appreciate that. Mr. Wickman. Okay. Also, the Family Farm Fiesta is this Saturday at Mount Air Community Garden. From, I think, 1 to 4. That's always a great event. Ms. Hodgson, anything?
I do have one quickie. We have another Lakewood school that is being recognized nationally, and that is South Lakewood Elementary is being awarded the 2016 Jan Harp Domene Diversity and Inclusion Award from the National PTA. So congratulations to the South Lakewood Elementary School.
Very cool. Mr. Graham? All right. Anything else for the good of the order? With that said, we will adjourn at 8:56. Have a good evening. Thanks for coming out and hanging out with us tonight. I hope you really enjoyed it. All right.
Stealing through the night, each little moment is clear before me, and though it brings me regret, it's easy to